Hello everyone, my name is Natalie of the Alternative Belgium History channel, and as a history lover, history nerd myself, who loves to travel of course, I always try to find the most interesting historical sites in the places I visit. It's very time consuming, it's not always very easy, so for Belgium I want to try to help you out. I've made videos about Bruges and Ghent, their top historical sites for history nerds. And now in this video we focus on Brussels. I've made a video on the World War II sites in Brussels before, so I will focus in this video on pre-20th century sites. I also want to add that Brussels has changed a lot more over the centuries than Bruges or Ghent did. It was such an important place, the capital. So there are a lot less medieval and other pre-19th century historical sites to choose from than in Bruges or in Ghent, but no worries, there's still plenty. The Royal Square on top of the Koudenberg Hill in what is now called the Royal Quarter of Brussels was once one of the most important political centers of Europe. Already in the 12th century, there was a defensive fortress here, which was transformed into a castle, a palace, after Brussels became the capital of the Duchy of Brabant in the 13th century. The Koudenberg Palace was the palace of the sovereign, which was first the Dukes of Brabant, then the Dukes of Burgundy, the Spanish Habsburg rulers of the Spanish Netherlands, and the Austrian Habsburg rulers of the Austrian Netherlands in the 18th century. We have a very complicated history, but it's especially after the Duchy of Brabant fell into the hands of the Dukes of Burgundy in the late 14th century, and more specifically Duke Philip the Good in the 15th century, that Brussels became a very important European center of power. The Dukes of Burgundy were known as very big spenders, including on extravagant decadence banquets. So you can imagine that their main residence, the Koudenberg Palace, had to reflect that reputation. A very prestigious state banqueting hall called the Aula Magna was added to the palace by Philip the Good. But the palace's most important and powerful resident was without a doubt the great-great-grandson of Philip the Good, Emperor Charles V, who brought together in the early 16th century the Duchy of Burgundy, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Spanish Empire, including their colonies. So the Koudenberg Palace became kind of Brussels' Versailles, the place to be at the time. It was much larger than just today's Royal Square. But unfortunately, the Koudenberg Palace was destroyed in a fire of 1731. Practically nothing was left, and what was left was taken down a few decades later and replaced by a new neoclassical square that you can see today. There are some traces, however, left under the current square and under the current buildings, which can be visited as an archaeological site. The second historical site is just down the road. We're still in the Royal Quarter here. What is now the Sablon neighborhood was just outside the first medieval city wall of Brussels. The wall was then halfway between the Royal Square and the Sablon. And in those days, it was the cemetery of the St. John's Hospital, as well as the practice grounds of the Crossbow Guild. The Crossbow Guild built a small chapel here in the early 14th century, which set off the transformation of this entire area when a woman brought to this chapel a miraculous statue of the Virgin Mary, stolen from arch-enemy Antwerp. This brought, of course, many pilgrims to the chapel, and pilgrims meant donations. And in the 15th century, the elegant Gothic church of the Sablon, which you see today, was built, and until today with a link to the old Royal Crossbowmen Guild. The heydays of the Sablon neighborhood were the 16th century, when the most prominent aristocratic families resided here to be close to the court at the Koudenberg Palace. Unfortunately, most of the palaces that were then surrounded by large gardens have disappeared. The only 16th century that has survived is the Egmont Palace, just behind the Petit Sablon Park, the residence of the Count of Egmont, top aristocrat in the 16th century. He and Count Hoorn, both represented on the fountain in the Petit Sablon Park, were executed for leading a rebellion against Spanish King Philip II, who was the son of Emperor Charles V. The St. Michael and St. Gudula Cathedral is like the Westminster Abbey of Belgium, the most important church where important marriages, coronations, funerals take place and have taken place for many centuries. Probably as early as the 9th century, there was a chapel here dedicated to St. Michael on this location. In the 11th century, it was replaced by a Romanesque church, and after the relics of Saint Gudula were transferred, it was given the double name of Collegiate Church of St. Michael and St. Gudula. You can still see the crypt and the foundations of the Romanesque church if you look down while walking through the nave of the church. As the city grew in importance, the church also needed an upgrade. Already in the early 13th century, the construction of the new Brabantine Gothic church started, but it took 300 years to finish. I included the Royal Galleries because it represents a very important historical process with a very lasting impact on the city. Belgium was still a very young nation in the mid-19th century and was in need for some drastic nation building. King Leopold I, and especially his son Leopold II, considered it their main mission to upgrade the capital city into a prestigious modern European capital. And one of those projects were the Royal Galleries, following the examples in Paris and in London. This part of the city still had its medieval neighborhoods. It was densely populated, it was very poor. The wealthy inhabitants did not even come near this area. So these galleries aimed to change this, providing them with a place to parade, stroll, with shops, theaters, fancy terraces, as well as luxurious apartments on the upper two levels. There was an entrance fee to ensure that the poor did not harass the rich. De Grand Place is of course the absolute highlight, and it's one of the most beautiful main squares in Europe, maybe even the world, and UNESCO World Heritage. But this square also has a very long history. It started as a very simple market square almost 1,000 years ago. But as Brussels grew more important, also as a place for trading, so did its market square. The merchants and tradesmen became wealthier, more powerful. And for the rich merchants, the patricians, the guilds, the area of the Grand Place became their center of power. And with them, the city, which in the Middle Ages had a very high degree of autonomy, led by the so-called patricians, rich, non-aristocratic, land-owning merchants. To show this power and wealth, they built their city hall, which is the oldest building on the square, and it's the only one actually that still originates from the Middle Ages. Practically all other medieval buildings have disappeared because at the end of the 17th century, 1695, the troops of French King Louis XIV, Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King, bombarded the center of Brussels. And by doing so, they practically flattened the historical heart of Brussels, including the Grand Place. The only building that was still mostly standing was the City Hall. Ironically, because the tower was actually their main target. Only some walls of some of the guild halls were still standing, but everything else was destroyed. The Grand Place was rebuilt in the following 4 years by the city's guilds. Their efforts were regulated by the city councillors and the governor of Brussels, who required that their plans be submitted to the authorities for approval. This resulted in the current harmonious-looking square, mainly in Flemish Baroque style. Much more history was written on this square. For instance, in the 19th century tavern The Swan, easily recognizable by the swan on its facade, a certain exile from Germany, Karl Marx, was spending most of his time while living in Brussels writing parts of his Communist Manifesto with his colleague Max Engels. Around the same time, just across the square, a French exile, Victor Hugo, was living, and he was working as well on his famous work Les Misérables. It is believed that Brussels originated on the location of the current Saint-Géry Square. It couldn't have looked more different than it does today. This was one of several islands in the Seine River. That's the river that crossed Brussels' lower town, the economic heart of the medieval city, and has therefore, of course, played a major role early on in the development and growth of Brussels. In the 10th century, Charles of Lower Lorraine built a chapel there on this island, dedicated to Saint-Géry of Cambrai. The important relics of St. Gudula were kept in this chapel until they were transferred to the St. Michael's Church. In the 16th century, a larger late Gothic church was built on the site of the chapel, but which was unfortunately demolished during the French occupation in the late 18th century. About a century later, the river Seine, disappeared as well. It was covered and the entire area was reorganized with, for instance, the Anspach Boulevard and large public buildings such as the Stock Exchange, La Bourse. On this site, which was an open-air market square at the time, the covered market halls you see today were built. And once again, we would have been standing on water about 200 years ago. This time it's not the covered river, but one of the docks of the 16th century port of Brussels. St. Catherine's Dock was filled in 1853 because port activities moved further away from the city centre. The current square was created on the vacated space in 1870, as well as the St. Catherine's Church. Brussels' first dock was on the banks of the Seine River, around the corner from the Grand Place, so right in the heart of the historical centre. In the mid-16th century, the first canal was dug between Brussels and the Ruppel River, which made this side of the city, of course, the ideal location for the new port. But even before this dock, this would have been water. St. Catherine's Dock was developed from the medieval city moat. Close by, on the other side of the St. Catherine's Church, you can still find one of the towers of the early 13th century city wall, the so-called Black Tower. As I mentioned, on the vacant space created by the filling of the dock in the 19th century, a new church was built, the St. Catherine's Church. Although new is not exactly right, because there was already a St. Catherine's here in the 15th century. The original St. Catherine's was located within the first city wall, so not exactly on the same spot as the current one. The tower survived because there was not enough money for a proper tower on the new church. Now, my strong appreciation for Beguinages is definitely not a secret if you've seen my videos on Bruges and Ghent. And while the Brussels Beguinage was founded around the same time, mid-13th century, it has definitely not been conserved as well as in those other cities. The Brussels Beguinage is not walled anymore. Most of the houses are not the Beguine houses anymore. A Beguinage was kind of a closed and a walled community, a village within the larger city where Beguines lived together. No men were allowed inside, not even to look inside. Beguines were very religious women, but they were not nuns. The most important differences were that they did not have to make eternal vows, so in theory they could leave the Beguinage if they wanted, and that they did not have to live an extremely sober life, and that they could bring their worldly possessions to their own house inside the Beguinage. Some even called them the first feminists. If you want to learn more, have a look at the video dedicated to Beguinages and Beguines. The Beguinage was closed by the French revolutionaries occupying Brussels in the late 18th century and was used to solve the sharply increased housing needs for the expanding Brussels population. There was also a major need for facilities where the sick and the elderly were taken care of. So still under French occupation, under Napoleon, a large complex was built that could accommodate not only elderly, but also people with disabilities and with incurable diseases on the location where the Beguinage's infirmary was. The most authentic part of the actual former Beguinage is the church, the St. John Baptist and Beguinage Church. The 17th century Baroque church replaced the medieval Gothic church at a time that the Beguinage consisted of more than 1,000 houses spread over 7 hectares. St. Michael's Square was built in the second half of the 18th century by the city of Brussels on what until then had been a bleaching meadow for washed textiles. At the time, it was a very modern square, very different than what they were used to. It was a fancy residential square with 56 bourgeois houses, whose residents would then be among those strolling through the royal galleries, for instance. St. Michael's Square was renamed later on to Martyrs Square after the Belgian Revolution, to honor the victims of the September days. Between the 23rd and the 26th of September 1830, heavy fighting took place in and around the Brussels Park between the people of Brussels and the Dutch army, who was trying to stop this revolt. 467 people died. They did not know what to do with these bodies of the fallen and buried some of them on the then St. Michael's Square. The following month, a commission appointed by the provisional government decided to make it a memorial for the victims of the revolution. The last one is the oldest one, the Sonian forest. The oldest known structures in the Sonian forest date from the Neolithic, and there are also 2 burial mounds from this or later times in the forest. Now, once Brussels was founded, the owners were the Counts of Leuven and later the Dukes of Brabant, who used the forest as a hunting ground from the end of the 12th century onwards. Exploitation by the population was strictly forbidden, except for the religious communities that were established there. Due to this strict management, the Sonian forest remained almost completely intact until the 15th century. The proximity of these attractive hunting grounds was one of the reasons why the aristocratic rulers of this area chose Brussels as the residence of their court. The Burgundian dukes, including Philip the Good, who once even got lost and almost died here in the forest, were frequent hunters, but also Emperor Charles V, his sister Mary of Hungary, and their brother Ferdinand, among many other famous historical figures. Under French rule, at the end of the 18th century, the forest still extended over more than 10,000 hectares. It suffered a very severe blow in 1801 when Napoleon Bonaparte had 22,000 oaks cut down for his Flottille de Boulogne, a fleet with which he intended to invade England. Well, I hope this helps for planning your next trip to Brussels. Again, this is not an exhaustive list. There's plenty of more historical sites to explore. And don't forget, Brussels is of course a city where every day history is made. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe to the channel if you want to learn more about Belgium, its history, from the Middle Ages to World War II, everything in between and beyond. Thank you.